The morning sun cast long shadows across the conference hall in Addis Ababa as delegates from 54 African nations gathered for what would become one of the most dangerous African Union summits in history. President Ibrahim Traoré arrived with his usual modest entourage, refusing the heavy security protocols that other leaders demanded. His philosophy remained unchanged since taking power through the revolution that swept across Burkina Faso like wildfire. Trust the people, lead from the front, and never hide behind walls of fear. The summit's agenda focused on economic independence and reducing foreign interference across the continent. Traoré had been the driving force behind this gathering, using his influence to convince skeptical leaders that Africa's future depended on breaking free from colonial economic structures that still strangled their nations decades after independence. His speeches had electrified audiences from Dakar to Nairobi, but they had also made him powerful enemies. 3,000 miles away in a nondescript office building in Paris, a different kind of meeting was taking place. The room contained no nameplates or official insignia, but the men gathered around the mahogany table wielded influence that extended far beyond any government ministry. They had been monitoring Traoré's growing influence with increasing alarm. His success in Burkina Faso was inspiring similar movements across West Africa, threatening carefully maintained economic relationships that had persisted since the colonial era. The man at the head of the table, known only as Dubois to his associates, spread satellite images of the summit venue across the surface. His voice carried the weight of decades spent manipulating African politics from the shadows. The plan they had developed was elegant in its simplicity. A bombing during the opening ceremony would eliminate not just Traoré, but several other troublesome leaders who had begun echoing his calls for true independence. Meanwhile, back in Addis Ababa, Traoré was reviewing his speech notes in his hotel suite when his chief of security, Captain Sankara, knocked on the door. The captain had served in the Presidential Guard since the early days of the revolution, earning his position through unwavering loyalty and an almost supernatural ability to detect danger. He entered with the careful movements of a man who had learned to trust his instincts above all else. Sankara carried a manila folder that contained intelligence reports from their network of supporters across Africa. The information inside would normally have been dismissed as conspiracy theories, but recent events had taught them that the most outrageous plots often contained kernels of truth. A contact in Morocco had intercepted communications suggesting that something significant was planned for the summit. The details were vague, but the timing was specific. The opening ceremony. What they did not know was that the plot had been months in the making. The explosives had been carefully positioned during the renovation of the conference hall the previous year. The devices were sophisticated, designed to appear as structural improvements while concealing enough destructive power to bring down the entire building. The detonation would be blamed on a gas leak, a tragic accident that would claim the lives of Africa's most progressive leaders. Traoré listened to Sankara's briefing with the calm intensity that had carried him through the darkest days of the revolution. He had survived assassination attempts before, but this felt different. The scale was larger, the implications more severe. If the intelligence was accurate, they were not just targeting him, but attempting to decapitate the entire movement toward African independence. The hotel suite fell silent except for the distant sounds of traffic from the streets below. Traoré walked to the window and gazed out at the city where the Organization of African Unity had been born decades earlier. He thought about the promises made by previous generations of leaders, promises that had been broken by corruption, cowardice, and foreign manipulation. This summit represented a chance to honor those broken promises, but only if they could survive the next 24 hours. Captain Sankara was already mobilizing their security team, but their resources were limited. They had deliberately kept their delegation small to avoid appearing militaristic, a decision that now seemed potentially fatal. The Ethiopian security forces were competent, but they had no reason to suspect that their own venue had been compromised months before the summit began. As evening approached, Traoré made a decision that would define not just his own fate, but the future of the independence movement he had helped to create. Rather than flee or cancel his appearance, he would attend the opening ceremony as planned. However, he would not go unprepared. If there truly was a bomb in the conference hall, they would find it before it could detonate. The search began at midnight. Sankara had recruited a team of engineers from the Burkinabe delegation, men who had learned their skills rebuilding their country after years of neglect and exploitation. They entered the conference hall through service entrances, using maintenance credentials that Sankara had obtained through contacts in the Ethiopian government. The building was vast, with dozens of rooms, corridors, and technical spaces where explosives could be hidden. For 3 hours, they searched methodically, following blueprints that showed every pipe, wire, and structural element. The work was painstaking and dangerous. If they were discovered, it would create a diplomatic incident that could derail the summit before it began. Worse, if the bombers had installed motion sensors or tamper detection systems, their search could trigger the very explosion they were trying to prevent. At 3:17 in the morning, one of the engineers found it. The device was concealed behind a false wall in the main auditorium, positioned to maximize casualties during the opening ceremony. The explosives were sophisticated, clearly the work of professionals with extensive training and unlimited resources. The timer was set for 10:30 a.m., exactly when Traoré was scheduled to deliver his keynote address. What happened next required a level of courage that few leaders would have possessed. Rather than simply defusing the bomb or evacuating the building, Traoré saw an opportunity to expose the conspiracy that threatened not just his life, but the future of African independence. He ordered his team to leave the device exactly as they had found it, but to install their own surveillance equipment to record whoever came to make final preparations. The next morning dawned clear and bright. Delegates began arriving at the conference hall at 8 a.m., unaware that they were walking into what was supposed to be their tomb. Traoré arrived precisely on schedule, his calm demeanor giving no indication of the drama that had unfolded during the night. He greeted fellow leaders with his usual warmth, even as his security team maintained constant communication through encrypted channels. At 9:45 a.m., their surveillance equipment detected movement near the bomb. A maintenance worker, using legitimate credentials, accessed the false wall and made final adjustments to the timer. The man was Middle Eastern, possibly Lebanese or Syrian, suggesting connections to international mercenary networks that operated throughout Africa. Most importantly, he was being directed by someone else through an earpiece, someone who was clearly monitoring the ceremony from a remote location. Captain Sankara faced an impossible choice. They could arrest the bomber immediately, but that would alert his handlers that the plot had been discovered. The real architects of the conspiracy would escape, free to try again at another time and place. Alternatively, they could wait until the last possible moment to act, maximizing their chances of identifying and capturing the entire network. Traoré made the decision for him. At exactly 10 a.m., as he was being introduced to address the assembly, he deviated from the planned protocol. Instead of taking the podium, he walked directly to the section of wall where the bomb was hidden. The audience, consisting of presidents, prime ministers, and diplomats from across Africa, watched in confusion as their colleague began what appeared to be an impromptu inspection of the building's architecture. The bomber, watching from his position in the technical booth above the auditorium, realized that something had gone wrong. His instructions had been clear. Wait for the signal, then detonate the device during the loudest applause of Traoré's speech. But the target was now standing directly next to the bomb, and the ceremony had deviated from its planned schedule. Speaking into his earpiece, the bomber received new instructions. Detonate immediately. The collateral damage would be acceptable as long as the primary target was eliminated. His finger moved toward the trigger, but in that instant, Captain Sankara struck. The security chief had positioned himself in the booth before the ceremony began, waiting for exactly this moment. The struggle was brief but violent. The bomber was well trained, but Sankara had the advantage of surprise and motivation. As they fought for control of the detonator, Traoré continued his theatrical inspection of the wall, keeping the device within reach while his security team evacuated the most important delegates under the pretense of a routine security drill. Meanwhile, the real masterminds of the plot were watching from their command center in a hotel suite across the city. When their bomber failed to respond to repeated radio calls, they realized that their carefully planned operation was collapsing. They had backup plans, but none that could be implemented quickly enough to salvage the mission. What they did not anticipate was that Traoré's intelligence network had been tracking them since their arrival in Addis Ababa. Ethiopian security forces, alerted by the Burkinabe delegation, surrounded the hotel within minutes. The conspirators found themselves trapped with evidence of their plot scattered across the room, including detailed building plans, photographs of targets, and communication equipment linking them to foreign intelligence services. Back in the conference hall, Traoré finally revealed the truth to the stunned assembly of African leaders. Standing next to the exposed bomb, he explained how foreign powers had attempted to eliminate the continent's most progressive voices in a single devastating attack. The device was carefully photographed and documented before being safely removed by Ethiopian explosive experts. The revelation sent shockwaves through the assembly. Leaders who had been skeptical of Traoré's warnings about foreign interference now saw tangible proof of the lengths to which their former colonial masters would go to maintain control. The attempted bombing became a rallying point, transforming a routine diplomatic gathering into a historic moment of African unity. The interrogation of the captured conspirators revealed the scope of the plot. The bombing was intended to be followed by a campaign of destabilization across West Africa, designed to install more compliant leaders who would reverse the economic reforms that threatened foreign interests. The evidence included financial records showing payments to rebel groups, lists of political figures marked for assassination, and detailed plans for military interventions disguised as peacekeeping missions. 3 days later, as the summit concluded with the strongest declarations of African independence in decades, Traoré reflected on how close they had come to disaster. The bomb had contained enough explosive power to destroy not just the conference hall, but several adjacent buildings. Hundreds of lives had been saved by the courage of a few individuals who refused to accept that their continent's destiny should be determined by foreign powers. The failed bombing attempt had consequences that extended far beyond the immediate threat. African leaders who had previously maintained quiet relationships with their former colonial masters now openly questioned those arrangements. New alliances formed between nations that had been kept deliberately separate by external influences. Most importantly, the independence movement that had begun in Burkina Faso gained momentum across the continent. Captain Sankara was later awarded Ethiopia's highest honor for preventing what could have been the deadliest terrorist attack in African history. He accepted the medal on behalf of all those who had risked their lives to expose the conspiracy, but he knew that their work was far from finished. The forces they had defeated would regroup and try again, perhaps with even more sophisticated methods. The bomber, identified as a Lebanese mercenary with connections to multiple intelligence services, provided additional information under interrogation. His network had been responsible for destabilization operations across 3 continents, always operating under cover of local conflicts or political disputes. The African Union bombing was intended to be their masterpiece, a single operation that would reshape the political landscape of an entire continent. 6 months after the failed attack, Traoré stood before the United Nations General Assembly in New York. His speech that day would be remembered as one of the most powerful condemnations of neocolonialism ever delivered on that platform. He presented evidence of the bombing plot to the entire world, naming the countries and organizations that had been involved in planning the attack. The international response was mixed. Some nations condemned the attempted bombing and called for investigations into their own intelligence services. Others dismissed the evidence as propaganda, claiming that African leaders were inventing external threats to distract from their own failures. But the damage to the credibility of traditional power structures was irreversible. What Traoré understood, and his enemies had failed to grasp, was that the independence movement he represented could not be stopped by eliminating its leaders. The ideas that drove the revolution were already spreading beyond any individual personality or political organization. The failed bombing had only accelerated that process, providing undeniable proof that the struggle for true independence was real and urgent. The conference hall in Addis Ababa was repaired and strengthened, becoming a symbol of African resilience in the face of external threats. A memorial was installed commemorating the attempt to silence the continent's progressive voices, and the courage of those who refused to be intimidated. Traoré returned to Burkina Faso with renewed determination to complete the transformation his revolution had begun. The investigation into the bombing plot continued for years, revealing connections to similar operations across Africa and other developing regions. The evidence showed a systematic campaign to prevent economic independence through violence, corruption, and political manipulation. These revelations sparked reforms in international law and greater scrutiny of intelligence operations disguised as diplomatic activities. But perhaps the most significant consequence of the failed bombing was the message it sent to ordinary Africans across the continent. Their leaders could not be intimidated or eliminated simply because they challenged the status quo. The independence movement was stronger than any individual, and it would survive any attempt to destroy it through violence or coercion. As Traoré often said in the speeches that followed the African Union Summit, the bomb that was meant to silence them had instead amplified their voices across the world. The conspiracy to eliminate African independence had become the catalyst for its acceleration. What was intended as an ending had become a beginning. The evening news broadcasts that carried the story of the foiled bombing reached millions of viewers across Africa and beyond. For the first time, many people understood that the struggle for true independence was not just about economics or politics, but about the fundamental right of nations to determine their own destiny without external interference. In the months that followed, similar plots were uncovered in other African capitals, suggesting that the Addis Ababa bombing was part of a broader strategy to eliminate progressive leadership across the continent. Each discovery strengthened the resolve of independence movements and weakened the credibility of those who claimed that external threats were exaggerated. The bomber's confession, obtained through patient interrogation rather than coercion, provided insights into the mindset of those who carried out such operations. He described a world where African independence was seen as a direct threat to global economic stability, justifying extreme measures to maintain the existing order. His handlers had convinced him that eliminating Traoré and his allies would save lives by preventing larger conflicts. What the bomber had not understood was that the conflicts he was supposedly preventing were already underway. They were economic conflicts, fought through debt structures and trade agreements that kept African nations dependent on their former colonial masters. The independence movement was not creating instability, but challenging the mechanisms that maintained a different kind of instability, one that enriched foreign powers while keeping African populations in poverty. The failed bombing ultimately became a turning point in African politics, marking the moment when the independence movement shifted from a regional phenomenon to a continental force. Leaders who had previously maintained neutrality in the struggle between traditional and progressive approaches now openly aligned themselves with the call for genuine sovereignty. As the sun set over the Ethiopian capital on the final day of the summit, Traoré knew that they had won more than just a tactical victory over their enemies. They had exposed the true nature of the forces arrayed against African independence, and in doing so, they had strengthened the movement beyond anything that could be achieved through speeches or diplomatic negotiations alone. The bomb that was meant to destroy them had instead forged them into something stronger. If you enjoyed it, please like, share, and subscribe to FictionWire Africa. This is a fictional story created purely for entertainment.